a young boy disappeared on a school trip and was declared dead. 10 years later, he returned with an unimaginable secret. The school bus moved along the winding mountain roads. Laughter, shouts, and jokes filled the air as the students enjoyed the thrill of a field trip they had been looking forward to for months. The mountainous landscape stretched out majestically before them, but for Ethan Parker, the outside world was merely a distraction that barely registered. Seated by the window, his gaze was fixed on the clouds, slowly drifting over the distant peaks, oblivious to the excitement around him. At 16, Ethan was a young man who seemed to live under a constant shadow. Unlike his classmates, who were living in the moment, his mind was trapped in a whirlwind of dark thoughts. For a long time, his relationship with his father, David, had evolved from mere teenage tension to something much deeper and more painful. David Parker, a demanding and stern man, never settled for anything less than perfection. And while Ethan's older sister, Sarah, had always met those expectations, he never managed to live up to them. He felt the constant weight of comparisons, biting remarks, and disappointed looks. Next to him, Sarah, always vigilant, chatted with some classmates. Although she had come on the trip partly to keep an eye on Ethan, her role as a protective sister was not something he had asked for, and it certainly didn't make him feel better. Despite her concern, an invisible barrier separated them. Ethan loved her, but being around her only reminded him of what he had never been able to be: the perfect son. Sarah had always excelled at everything, whether it was academics, sports, or social life. To Ethan, she was a constant reminder of his own shortcomings. The bus finally came to a stop at the base camp. The students quickly got off, breathing in the fresh mountain air. Mr. Walters, their teacher, gave clear instructions. Don't stray from the group, stay on the trails, and don't explore alone. The mountains were treacherous, and though beautiful, they could turn into a deadly trap for reckless youngsters. But for a group of adrenaline-filled teenagers, these warnings only added a hint of thrill. As everyone dispersed, Ethan felt a growing discomfort. The commotion around him bothered him, and the more he watched others enjoying themselves, the tighter the knot in his stomach became. Sarah, as always, was busy looking out for him, but that day, the instinct to escape became stronger. I don't need her to babysit me. I'm not a kid, he thought. He decided to keep his distance, waiting for his sister to get distracted by her friends so he could slip away unnoticed. Soon after, as the students began organizing themselves into smaller groups for hikes, Ethan started fading into the shadows of the trees. Sarah was engrossed in chatting with some friends, and for a moment, she forgot her role as protector. It was the perfect opportunity. The forest, with its tall trees and crunchy carpet of leaves, called to him. With each step he took, the noise of the group faded further into the distance. The main trail was clearly marked, but Ethan had no interest in sticking to the safe path. He wanted to escape, even if just for a few hours, from everything that weighed him down. Family expectations, constant comparisons, and the feeling of not fitting in anywhere. The woods seemed to offer that temporary freedom he so desperately needed. As he moved further from the group, the atmosphere around Ethan began to shift. The air felt heavier, and although he was surrounded by nature, something seemed off. The crunch of branches underfoot and the whispering wind through the leaves created a sound that, instead of soothing, filled him with an eerie unease. Yet rather than turn back, Ethan pressed on, drawn by a curious sense of calm mixed with danger. And then he saw it, a metallic glimmer in the distance, barely visible between the trees. It was as if something in the woods was calling out to him, an object that didn't belong there. Without thinking much, he veered off the marked path and started walking in that direction. The trees closed in around him, forming a natural tunnel that led him further away from the group. Just a quick look, he told himself. I'll see what it is, and then go back. But deep down, he knew there was no turning back. Curiosity had turned into something more, a compulsion he couldn't control. As he approached the clearing where the flash seemed to come from, Ethan's heart began to beat faster. The silence of the forest was now overwhelming. The sun, which had been shining brightly, seemed to hide behind a sudden layer of clouds, casting long, cold shadows. Finally, he reached the clearing. In the center, partially buried in the ground, was a strange object. It looked old, rusty, and out of place in that natural setting. It didn't have a clear shape. At first glance, it could have been a piece of forgotten machinery or perhaps an artifact from some ancient ritual. Ethan stepped closer, intrigued. He was about to touch it when a sound broke the silence. Footsteps. They weren't animal footsteps. They were firm, human, and getting closer from the edge of the clearing. Ethan turned sharply, searching for the source of the noise, and what he saw made his skin prickle. In the shadows of the trees, he saw several hooded figures moving slowly towards him. Their faces were hidden beneath the hoods, but their movements were synchronized, as if they had been waiting for his arrival. A chill ran down his spine. Ethan took a step back, but there was no escape. The figures were slowly closing in, forming a circle. He was trapped. Panic overwhelmed him. He tried to run, but before he could move, a firm hand gripped his shoulder. Everything happened so fast that he didn't have time to process it. Murmurs began among the hooded figures, and their words were unintelligible, as if they were speaking an ancient language. And then, darkness. Ethan fell to the ground. Everything around him faded away. The last sensation he felt was of being dragged by those unseen hands, until his mind went completely blank. The fresh mountain breeze no longer felt so pleasant. In a matter of minutes, what had started as a day full of excitement and laughter turned into a slow, unfolding nightmare. The teachers were gathering the students at the base camp, making a quick list of who was present. Sarah Parker paced nervously back and forth, casting quick glances at the trails. Her instinct told her something was wrong. "Where's Ethan?" she asked, worry evident in her voice. Mr. Walters, a calm but visibly exhausted man from years of dealing with teenagers, looked at her with a faint smile, trying to reassure her. "Don't worry, Sarah. He's probably with one of the other groups. He might have lost track of time. It's easy to do in the woods." However, Sarah wasn't convinced. She knew her brother wasn't the type to wander off out of curiosity, at least not without telling her. She remembered seeing him slip away subtly while she chatted with her friends, but had assumed he just needed some space. Now, guilt began to gnaw at her. "I should have been more vigilant," she thought, her stomach tightening with anxiety. Minutes turned into hours, and the search party began to form. First, it was the teachers and some students, but soon local rescue teams were called in. What initially seemed like a simple case of getting lost was slowly turning into something much more serious. The sun began to set, and the mountain air grew colder by the minute. Flashlights and rescue vehicles' headlights lit up the woods in an attempt to find Ethan. But every new effort proved futile. Rescuers returned with the same response: no trace of him, no footprints, no sounds, just the oppressive silence of the forest. Sarah watched, hugging herself, her face pale as the words of comfort from adults became increasingly hollow. David Parker, Ethan's father, had arrived at the camp as soon as he heard the news. His usually firm and severe face showed a tension Sarah had never seen. But behind his exterior of a protective father, there was also a sharp pain and a simmering rage. David approached Sarah with a look that mixed reproach and desperation. "Where were you when he disappeared?" David's voice, though not loud, was laden with accusation. Sarah felt the sting of his words. "It's my fault," she thought as tears began to well up in her eyes. "I should have seen him. I should have stopped him. I was distracted. I didn't think he'd go that far." The words came out weak, almost like a plea for forgiveness. But David wasn't ready to offer comfort. "Your job was to look after him, Sarah. He's your younger brother. How could you lose sight of him?" The harshness of his voice cut through Sarah like a dagger, intensifying the weight of her guilt. The exchange was brief, but it left a lasting mark. Sarah, already consumed by guilt, now bore the weight of her father's disappointment. David, unable to cope with the pain of losing his son, began to emotionally distance himself from both, sinking deeper into his own frustration and grief. When the search teams reported no clear signs of Ethan, local authorities intervened and assigned Lauren Brooks as the detective in charge. Lauren was known for her tenacity and ability to solve complex cases. With a spotless reputation, taking on Ethan Parker's case became personal from the moment she heard the story. She arrived at the base camp determined, her eyes quickly scanning the situation. She spoke with the teachers, students, and parents, gathering as much information as possible. Talking to Sarah, she noticed the pain in the young woman's eyes, but also something else, the shadow of guilt. "Don't punish yourself," Lauren said in a firm but empathetic voice. "This isn't your fault, Sarah. The mountains can be treacherous, but we'll do everything we can to find him." However, progress was slow. The investigation yielded no clear clues. Security cameras at the park's entrance showed nothing out of the ordinary, and searches in the surrounding areas revealed no trace of where he could have gone. As hours turned into days, the tension in the community grew, and the Parker family sank deeper into their own emotional abyss. The days following Ethan's disappearance were a whirlwind of emotions for the family. Local media covered the story constantly, speculating on what might have happened. David, unable to bear the pressure, began losing hope much faster than Sarah or Ethan's mother. To him, each day without news was confirmation that his son wouldn't return. The base camp was dismantled after a week of intensive searching. Lauren Brooks, though persistent, couldn't shake the feeling of defeat. For a detective so committed, failing to find Ethan was a heavy blow. But what troubled her most was the mystery itself. There were no clear signs of a struggle, no trace of where he might have gone. It was as if Ethan had vanished into thin air. Sarah, on the other hand, refused to stop looking. While others tried to accept the worst, she clung to the belief that her brother was alive somewhere, waiting to be found. Time can be unforgiving. For most people in town, Ethan Parker's disappearance had become a distant tragedy, another story among many that inevitably faded into obscurity. However, for the Parker family, those 10 years didn't mean the passage of time, but an extension of pain. The Parker house, once warm and full of life, now felt empty, wrapped in constant silence. The echo of children's laughter, lively dinner conversations, everything had disappeared. The house's walls seemed to contain invisible scars, traces of the suffering that had consumed the family since Ethan vanished. Sarah Parker, now 29, had become a resilient woman, but deeply marked by guilt. Over the years, she had tried to rebuild her life. She finished her studies, found a stable job, and tried to maintain an appearance of normality. But deep down, every step she took was tinged by the void her brother left behind. Nights were especially hard. There were times when she dreamed of Ethan, imagining him coming back, safe and sound, only to wake up and feel the cold reality once more. The day Ethan disappeared had been a breaking point for the family, but especially for David, his father. The man who had once been a stern and demanding figure had transformed into someone bitter and distant. Losing his son was more than a tragedy. It was a personal failure. He hadn't been able to protect his family, and bitterness had consumed him. The relationship with Sarah, already strained before the disappearance, had completely deteriorated. David could never stop blaming her, at least silently, for not having been more attentive that day. "If you had been more responsible," those unspoken words lingered in the air between them. At home, the atmosphere was charged with a melancholy neither seemed willing to break. Sarah tried to keep the home in order, but loneliness and remorse slowly ate away at her. David barely spoke, and when he did, it was only to say what was necessary, as if the feelings that once united him to his family had been extinguished by the tragedy. It was a chilly autumn afternoon when the air was starting to shift from warm to cold, signaling the arrival of winter. Sarah was in the kitchen, making a cup of tea, lost in her thoughts, while David read the newspaper in the living room, as was his custom. It seemed like just another day, a monotonous routine they had grown accustomed to. Neither expected anything to change that day. After 10 years, life had gone on, though marked by an indelible absence. A gentle knock on the door interrupted the silence. At first, Sarah didn't pay much attention. Maybe it was a neighbor or some door-to-door salesperson. But when the second knock came, this time a bit louder, she felt a strange knot form in her stomach. For no apparent reason, her heart started beating faster. David, with a faint look of annoyance, glanced at her, as if expecting her to answer the door. When Sarah turned the doorknob and opened the door, her world came to a halt. There, standing in the doorway, was a man who seemed to have stepped out of her deepest dreams and nightmares. Ethan. But he was not the 16-year-old boy she remembered, full of life and energy. In front of her stood a thin man with pale skin, a scruffy beard, and eyes. Those eyes. Ethan's eyes were no longer the same. They were filled with something Sarah couldn't quite identify. It seemed empty, disconnected, as if he were trapped in some distant place. A shiver ran down her spine. "Ethan," was all Sarah could say, her voice breaking. The man in front of her nodded slowly, but said nothing. There was an unsettling silence in the air, as if words had no place at that moment. David, hearing his son's name, stood up immediately. Seeing Ethan standing at the door, a mix of emotions crossed his face: disbelief, anger, relief, and confusion. "Is it really you?" he asked, but his voice lacked the warmth one would expect when reuniting with a lost son. Ethan simply nodded again, still silent. Sarah, tears streaming down her cheeks, tried to approach him, but something held her back. There was something different about her brother. He was no longer the boy she knew. He seemed like a stranger, someone who had seen things no one else could imagine. "Where have you been?" she wanted to ask, but the words wouldn't come out. The fear of shattering the fragile moment paralyzed her. David, instead of showing joy at his son's return, seemed to be struggling with suspicion. After so many years, he had buried the idea that Ethan could be alive. Now, faced with his return, his mind couldn't process it. "What the hell happened to you? Why didn't you come back sooner?" he demanded, with a harshness that surprised Sarah. But Ethan still didn't offer any answers. His expression remained vacant, as if the questions didn't matter to him, or as if he didn't know how to answer them. He simply stepped inside the house, moving slowly and wearily, as if every movement was an effort. Sarah watched him with a mixture of relief and fear. "This isn't the Ethan I knew," she thought. The days following Ethan's return were bewildering. Sarah tried desperately to reconnect with him, eager to understand what had happened during those 10 years. But Ethan barely spoke. He spent most of his time locked in his room, staring out the window as if waiting for something, or maybe as if he were lost in a place only he could see. Sometimes, when Sarah tried to talk to him, he looked at her as if he didn't quite recognize her. The tension in the house was unbearable. David avoided Ethan, unsure how to deal with his return. He refused to accept that his son was truly back. What if this isn't real? What if he's here for some reason we don't understand? His thoughts grew darker. There was something about Ethan's behavior that deeply unsettled him, and he couldn't shake the feeling that his son hadn't returned by chance. Sarah, on the other hand, desperately tried to find some trace of the person her brother had been. But the more she tried, the more she realized that the Ethan she knew wasn't there. This man, though her brother by blood, was a stranger, marked by secrets he didn't want to share. As the days passed, Ethan began to show worrying signs. At night, Sarah would hear him murmuring in his sleep, words she couldn't quite understand. Other times, she found him sitting in the dark, wide-eyed, as if he were reliving something only he could see. Ethan seemed to be battling something invisible, something that kept him tied to a past he couldn't fully remember. One night, Sarah saw him trembling violently in his bed, eyes closed, trapped in a nightmare that seemed all too real. When she tried to wake him, he screamed as if caught in a parallel reality. "No, don't touch me," he shouted, jerking away from her, a look of panic on his face. Sarah stepped back, terrified, and at that moment, she realized that Ethan's return wouldn't be the end of their suffering, but the beginning of a new nightmare. The days dragged on slowly in the Parker household after Ethan's return. Although the news of his reappearance had shocked the small community within the walls of their home, the atmosphere was much more somber. Each family member wrestled with their own emotions, with the growing tension and unanswered questions about what had really happened to Ethan during those 10 years. Ethan's disturbing episodes became more frequent. Though he never spoke of what he had experienced during his disappearance, his behavior indicated that something dark and traumatic was haunting him. It was as if his mind was trapped between two realities, the present and the terrible memories that were beginning to surface. One night, as Sarah was in the kitchen, she heard noises coming from Ethan's room. When she approached, she found him sitting on the floor, trembling, with his head in his hands. He was muttering broken words, his body agitated by some kind of internal panic. I can't go back there," he repeated, his voice choked with fear. Sarah kneeled beside him, trying to soothe him, but every attempt was futile. "Ethan, what's wrong? Where is there? What are you remembering?" But there was no response. Ethan's eyes filled with tears, and although his sister held him tightly, he seemed more lost than ever. At night, the nightmares trapped him as if they were real. Every time he closed his eyes, Ethan relived scenes he could barely understand. Hooded faces, rituals he couldn't fully remember, and a constant sensation of being watched by forces he couldn't see or grasp. The dreams were chaotic, but one thing was clear. He had been under the control of someone or something, and that experience had left him broken. Sarah tried to talk to him about what he saw in his dreams, but Ethan rarely managed to articulate what was going on in his mind. It's like being trapped, unable to escape. They made me do things I didn't want to, but I don't know why I couldn't resist. These words only deepened Sarah's concern, who began to fear that her brother was battling a trauma more profound than she had ever imagined. Ethan's presence hadn't brought relief, but rather a growing discomfort. David Parker, always distant since his son's disappearance, now seemed even colder and more aloof. Instead of trying to reconnect with Ethan, he maintained an attitude of distrust. "Something's not right with him," he told Sarah one evening, as they both watched Ethan sitting silently, staring out the window. "He's not the same, and I don't know if he ever will be." Sarah, although she didn't admit it aloud, shared some of those fears. Her brother had returned, but his return seemed more like a riddle than a relief. His erratic behavior, his prolonged silences, and the visions that tormented him only heightened the sense that something was deeply wrong. Whatever happened to him, it's still chasing him, Sarah thought, and I don't know how to help him. Ethan's isolation also strained his relationship with his father. David, unable to cope with the fact that his son couldn't offer any clear explanation, withdrew even further. His attempts to talk to Ethan ended in arguments or tense silences. "If you can't tell us what happened, how do you expect us to help you?" he said once, his voice filled with frustration. But Ethan couldn't speak of what he didn't fully understand. All he knew was that the memories were beginning to surface, but they were distorted fragments, images he couldn't piece together into a coherent story. Upon hearing about Ethan's return, Lauren Brooks, the detective who had tirelessly worked on his case 10 years ago, decided to visit the Parker family. For her, Ethan's case had been a personal defeat, an open wound that had never healed. Now that he was back, she didn't just want answers. She wanted to understand what had happened and if there could be more victims in similar situations. When she arrived at the Parker house, she was greeted by Sarah, who led her to the living room, where Ethan was sitting in his chair, staring at the floor. At the sight of Lauren, he lifted his head, but showed no recognizable emotion. It was as if he was there, but not entirely. "Ethan, I'm Detective Brooks. I handled your case when you disappeared 10 years ago. I've come to talk to you to understand what happened, if you can remember." Ethan didn't respond immediately. Lauren observed him closely, looking for any sign of recognition or willingness to talk, but found only a vacant expression. After a long silence, Ethan finally spoke, his voice weak but clear. "I don't remember. Not everything. There are things that don't make sense." Lauren, trying not to push him too hard, gently encouraged him to share whatever he could. "Don't worry if you don't have all the answers. Anything you can remember will help." Ethan put his hands on his head, clearly distressed. "I remember shadows, hooded figures. There were people, but they didn't seem human. They didn't speak. I don't know what was real and what wasn't. Sometimes I think it was a dream. Other times I feel like I'm still there." Ethan's words sent chills down Lauren and Sarah's spines. Although it wasn't clear what he had experienced, it was evident that it had been something deeply traumatic and disturbing. Lauren wrote down every detail, convinced that those fragments of memories could be keys to unraveling the mystery. After Lauren's visit, things started to get worse. Ethan began noticing strange signs that he was being watched. Unanswered phone calls, shadows appearing fleetingly at the window at night, and that constant feeling that someone was nearby, stalking him from the darkness. One afternoon, while Sarah and Ethan were at home, they heard noises in the backyard. Sarah, trying to stay calm, went to investigate, but found no one. However, Ethan was convinced that someone had been there. "They're looking for me. They want me to go back," he said, with a tone that mixed fear and resignation. Sarah looked at him, terrified at the possibility that what he was saying might be true. "Who's looking for you, Ethan? Who are they?" she asked, hoping for some answer that could calm her mind. But Ethan just shook his head. "I don't know, but I feel like they won't leave me alone." Detective Lauren Brooks couldn't stop thinking about Ethan Parker's case. Throughout her career, she had solved many mysteries, but Ethan's disappearance had left a mark on her, an unsolved puzzle that haunted her even after so many years. Ethan's return not only reopened the case, but also brought new questions. Where had he been? Who had held him captive? And most importantly, why couldn't he remember clearly what had happened? After her visit to the Parker house, Lauren delved back into the case files, looking for any clue she might have overlooked a decade ago. What troubled her wasn't just Ethan's psychological state, but also the growing feeling that there was something darker behind all of this, something she couldn't see clearly, but that was present in each of his fragmented memories. As she combed through the files, Lauren began noticing a disturbing pattern. There were other cases of disappearances in the nearby mountains, cases that, like Ethan's, had no clear explanation. Some of the missing had returned years later, like Ethan, but all of them came back with vague, fragmented memories, and many displayed signs of severe trauma or erratic behavior. Others never returned, remaining as unsolved mysteries. One case that caught her attention was that of Michael Carter, a young man who had disappeared under similar conditions to Ethan's, but in a neighboring state. Like Ethan, he had returned without remembering clear details of where he had been. Lauren decided to reach out to the families of these returned missing persons, seeking more information. The more she investigated, the clearer it became that she wasn't dealing with random disappearances. There was a pattern, a connection, but she couldn't decipher it yet. In each of these cases, the victims who returned described hooded figures, strange rituals, and a constant feeling of having been mentally controlled. The palpable fear in the voices of those who described these incomplete memories indicated that it wasn't mere hallucinations or personal trauma. Something, or someone, was behind all of this. As Lauren dug deeper into her investigation, a name began appearing repeatedly: Isaac Hale. Hale was an enigmatic man, known for leading several spiritual and self-help communities in the past, all of them linked to ideas of mind control, psychological manipulation, and ritualistic practices. Though he had never been formally accused of any crime, his name subtly surfaced in investigations of disappearances and strange behavior among his followers. Lauren was convinced that Hale had something to do with Ethan's disappearance and the other young people's. Although there were no concrete ties linking him directly, the fact that his name came up in several testimonies of people who had gone through experiences similar to Ethan's was enough to raise suspicion. She decided to dig deeper into Hale's history, discovering that he had been the leader of a secret community where he used mind control methods to maintain power over his followers. Some witnesses who had managed to escape his grasp described him as a charismatic and manipulative man, someone who could control people's will with unsettling ease. Yet there had never been enough evidence to bring him to justice, and Hale had managed to stay in the shadows for years. Meanwhile, in the Parker household, Ethan continued to struggle with the fragments of memories flooding his mind. Each day, the flashbacks became more intense and terrifying. They weren't just blurry visions of hooded faces, but scenes of what seemed to be rituals and extreme psychological tests. He remembered being in a dark place, windowless, surrounded by people who silently watched him. Although he couldn't recall everything clearly, he felt he had been manipulated, that he had been subjected to such deep mental control that he had lost his sense of self. During one of his most intense episodes, Ethan remembered the name Isaac Hale. Though he didn't know exactly who this man was, something in his mind linked him to everything. In one of his nightmares, he heard a whispering voice, soft but authoritative, repeating his name over and over, as if he had been programmed to obey it. Isaac Hale, Ethan murmured as Sarah tried to calm him. When Lauren heard that Ethan had mentioned Hale, she knew she was on the right track. Ethan was yet another victim of this man, someone who had been mentally controlled, perhaps manipulated to the point where he couldn't distinguish reality from nightmares. With Lauren and Sarah's help, Ethan began working on piecing together his memories. As they progressed, they discovered that the flashbacks weren't just hallucinations or post-traumatic delusions. Something more profound and terrifying was at play. Isaac Hale hadn't just controlled Ethan, he had programmed him for something. Although it wasn't clear what that something was, the fragments of his memories began suggesting that he had been part of a larger organization, a cult with sinister goals. Ethan remembered being subjected to psychological tests, to situations that pushed him to the brink of his mental resilience. "They wanted to break me," he said on one occasion, his voice trembling. "They wanted me to stop being myself." The rituals, the hooded figures, the whispering voices, all pointed to his having been part of something far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. The more Ethan remembered, the deeper his paranoia grew. He was convinced that Isaac Hale's cult was still watching him, waiting for the right moment to take him back. The anonymous phone calls continued, and the shadows appearing near his home became more frequent. Sarah, now convinced that something real was stalking her brother, tried to protect him, but fear gripped her as well. One afternoon, while Ethan was alone at home, he heard footsteps outside. He slowly approached the window and saw a hooded figure watching from the edge of the yard. Panic overwhelmed him, and he ran to the door, barricading it with everything within reach. The figure disappeared quickly, but the fear had already taken deep root in his mind. "They know I'm here. They'll never leave me alone." Meanwhile, Lauren kept investigating Hale, tracking his whereabouts and speaking with former members of his spiritual communities. The more she delved into his world, the clearer it became that Hale had built a network of loyal followers, people willing to do anything for him. But one question still remained. Why Ethan? What role had he played in all this? Lauren realized that Ethan wasn't just a victim. Hale had programmed his mind to carry out a mission, though even Ethan didn't know for sure what that mission was. The only thing clear was that the cult hadn't finished with him. They wanted something from Ethan, something he still couldn't fully remember. The paranoia at the Parker house had become unbearable. Ethan, increasingly tormented by the memories of his time in captivity, felt trapped in a constant nightmare. The shadows in his mind were beginning to take shape in the real world. Anonymous phone calls, hooded figures appearing at the corners of his vision, and the persistent feeling of being watched. But this time, the threat wasn't just in his head. Isaac Hale's cult wanted something from him, and they would do whatever it took to reclaim him. The weight of the situation also fell on Sarah. Although she tried to maintain a facade of strength, her worry for Ethan consumed her day by day. She couldn't sleep well, feared leaving her brother alone at home, and began feeling that her own life was revolving around Ethan's haunting past. Yet, she couldn't imagine what was about to happen. It was a cloudy afternoon when the nightmare took shape. Sarah had just left work and was driving home, as she did every day. As she drove through the deserted streets leading to the Parker house, she noticed a black vehicle following her for several minutes now. At first, she didn't think much of it, but when the car sped up and began approaching dangerously, fear started to settle in her chest. She accelerated, trying to lose the vehicle, but it stayed firmly on her trail. Her heart raced faster, and with every turn she took, the feeling that something terrible was about to happen grew stronger. In the distance, she could see the entrance to the neighborhood where she lived, but before she could reach it, the black car suddenly sped up, cutting her off. Two men stepped out of the vehicle and approached her with determined strides. Sarah, paralyzed by fear, tried to open the door to flee, but before she could, the men yanked her out of the car roughly. "No!" she screamed, struggling to break free, but it was useless. They forced her into the back seat of the black SUV, while one of the men covered her mouth to keep her from screaming. The SUV sped off, leaving behind the streets Sarah knew so well. Terror consumed her. "What do they want from me?" she thought, tears streaming down her face. She knew this had to do with Ethan, that the cult had come for him, and now they were using her to get to her brother. When Ethan realized Sarah hadn't come home at the usual time, something inside him stirred. He had a deep feeling that something had gone terribly wrong. He tried calling her mobile several times, but there was no response. After a few minutes, anxiety turned into panic, and the darkest thoughts began invading his mind. Finally, the call came. The voice on the other end was cold, calculated. "You know who we are, Ethan. You know what we want. If you want to see your sister again, you'll have to do what we say." Ethan felt his blood run cold. "What have you done to her?" he asked, his voice breaking with fear. He couldn't bear the thought of Sarah being in danger because of him. The voice on the other end replied, "Sarah is fine, for now. But if you don't come back with us, everything will change. You know you can't escape. It's time for you to return." They hung up, leaving Ethan in a state of shock. He knew the cult wanted him back, and now they were using his sister as bait. The words, "It's time for you to return," echoed in his mind like a dark, disturbing refrain. Panic and despair flooded him, but something deeper surfaced, a fierce determination to save Sarah, no matter the cost. Ethan knew he couldn't face this alone. Without wasting time, he contacted the only person who could help him, Detective Lauren Brooks. Upon hearing what had happened, Lauren immediately knew that the kidnapping was the cult's doing. She understood they were reaching the climax of this dark mystery, and that every decision they made from that moment on would have definitive consequences. Lauren arrived quickly at the Parker house, where she found a desperate but determined Ethan. He knew the cult had Sarah, and that he had no choice but to face them. "We can't act without a plan," Lauren warned, staying calm amid the chaos. "They have Sarah, but they also want you. We can use that to our advantage." Together, they began devising a plan to rescue Sarah and dismantle the cult once and for all. Ethan knew that facing Isaac Hale would be the greatest challenge of his life. They controlled me before. I don't know if I'll be able to resist this time, he admitted, his voice filled with fear. But Lauren looked at him with determination. You have more strength than you think, Ethan. And this time, you're not alone. As Lauren and Ethan worked on their plan, Isaac Hale's cult was already setting its own strategy in motion. They knew Ethan would do anything to save his sister, and they were prepared to face him. Hale, an enigmatic and calculating man, had been waiting for this moment. His control over Ethan wasn't just a matter of power, but a test to prove that he could bend anyone's will if he wanted to. Ethan was his greatest creation. He had shaped him, programmed him mentally, and though Ethan had escaped once, Hale was sure he would fall under his control again. He's destined to return, Hale told his followers, and when he does, we'll be stronger than ever. The cult gave Ethan a clear ultimatum. If he wanted to save his sister, he had to return to where it all began. They told him he had to go alone, without weapons, without the police. They knew Lauren would be involved, but they trusted Ethan would follow their orders to protect Sarah. As Ethan prepared for the confrontation, the voices in his head began to torment him again. He remembered the rituals, the hooded figures, and the feeling that his mind wasn't entirely his. Don't let them control you, he told himself, repeating those words like a mantra. But the fear lingered. What if I'm not strong enough? Lauren, aware that time was running out, said, "Trust yourself. What they did to you was horrible, but they haven't destroyed you. You have control now." With the plan in place, Ethan and Lauren headed to the location where the cult had indicated they should meet. An old complex in the middle of the mountains, the same place where Ethan had disappeared a decade earlier. It was a perfect setting for a final showdown. The shadows of the tall trees and the mist covering the area gave it an air of mystery and danger. Ethan, knowing that his and Sarah's lives were at stake, gathered all his strength. He knew that Isaac Hale's power wasn't just physical, but mental. He had to face the memories, the fears, and the voices that still tormented him. But this time, he wasn't alone. Lauren would be by his side, and they would do everything possible to dismantle the cult and save Sarah. Hours later, the wind howled as Ethan and Lauren prepared for the rescue. The atmosphere in the car was heavy. Both knew that time was running out. Sarah was in danger, and every passing minute increased the risk. Despite the palpable tension, Lauren remained calm, organizing each step of the plan with precision. Ethan, however, was lost in his thoughts, battling the memories and shadows that besieged him. They knew they couldn't go directly to the police. The cult had made it clear that any attempt to involve authorities would endanger Sarah's life. Therefore, Lauren and Ethan devised a careful plan, knowing they had to enter the cult's territory and face Isaac Hale. Lauren had obtained crucial information about the complex where the cult operated, an old abandoned building deep in the mountains. It was a place surrounded by nature, isolated from the rest of the world, making it perfect for Hale's dark activities and his group of followers. They knew the rescue had to be quick and silent. Lauren planned to infiltrate, while Ethan, who held the key to what they wanted, distracted Hale long enough to free Sarah. As they planned, Ethan expressed his doubts. What if I can't resist? What if they trap me mentally again? Lauren, with a firm look, met his eyes and said, "You broke free from them once. I know you can do it again. Don't forget you have something they never did, your strength to fight for those you love." Ethan nodded, even though he wasn't fully convinced. He knew that facing Isaac Hale didn't just mean confronting the man, but also battling the mental monsters that had lived in his head for 10 years. "I can't fail, Sarah," he kept thinking. The fear of falling back under Hale's control haunted him. The memories of the dark rituals he had endured during his captivity still tormented him. The hooded figures, the murmurs in an unknown language, and the sensation of losing control of his own mind grew stronger every time he approached the place where it all began. It was as if the cult had planted seeds in his mind, waiting to sprout at the right moment. Lauren, who noticed Ethan's inner struggle, tried to keep him focused. "Remember who you are now," she said as they drove toward the mountains. "You're not the same boy they took 10 years ago. You've changed. You're stronger." But Ethan still doubted, the echo of Hale's voice still resonating deep in his subconscious, reminding him that his will had been broken once before. The confrontation with Isaac Hale would be not just physical, but also mental. Ethan knew the cult had a power over him that could awaken at any moment, and that fear consumed him. The voices, the hooded faces, and the sensation of being controlled were constant in his mind. What if they force me to betray Sarah? The question plagued him, but he couldn't afford to give in to fear. Not this time. Hours before heading to the compound, Ethan received a final message from the cult. "If you're not here by midnight, your sister will die. Come alone. There's no escape." The threat was clear, but Lauren was determined not to let the cult have the upper hand. They knew they needed to act swiftly and precisely. The ultimatum only increased the pressure on Ethan, who was on the verge of an emotional breakdown. He felt trapped between the fear of failure and the need to save Sarah. Lauren urged him to stay strong, telling him that the plan was in place and they wouldn't let the cult win. "Trust the plan," she said, trying to instill confidence in him. As they neared the compound, the landscape grew darker and more desolate. The tall trees and the mist covering the road added to the sense of impending danger. Ethan could feel his anxiety rising with every mile they drove. The compound where the cult operated was the same place where he had been taken 10 years ago. It all started here, he thought, as his heart pounded. The air grew colder as they entered the mountains, and the sensation of being watched became more intense. Lauren remained calm, but she knew they were stepping into dangerous territory. "Remember the plan," she whispered as they checked the gear they'd be using. Ethan, with his mind torn between the present and the memories of his captivity, struggled to focus. "I have to do this for Sarah," he repeated to himself over and over. He knew there was no room for error. As Ethan and Lauren approached, Isaac Hale stood at the center of the compound, surrounded by his loyal followers. He had been waiting for this moment for years, the moment Ethan would return. To Hale, Ethan wasn't just an experiment, he was a living proof of his power. He had programmed him, molded his mind, and now wanted to show that his control over him was still intact. Hale, with his cold and calculating charisma, had kept his followers under tight control for years. The cult didn't just blindly follow his orders. They believed Ethan was the key to something much greater, a power only Hale fully understood. "He will come," Hale told his followers with a calm and confident voice. "He's destined to return. I programmed him for this moment." But what Hale didn't know was that Ethan had changed, that the experience of escaping his control had given him a strength he didn't have before. And now, with Lauren by his side, he was determined to face the demons that had kept him prisoner for so long. When Ethan and Lauren reached the edge of the compound, they knew there would be no room for mistakes. Ethan would have to face Isaac Hale directly, while Lauren tried to free Sarah. The key to the plan was keeping the cult distracted long enough for them to act. The compound, with its high walls and broken windows, loomed like a monument to the horrors Ethan had lived through. The air around the place was thick with a dark energy, as if the past and the present were intertwined in that very space. Ethan took a deep breath, knowing that everything depended on his ability to resist Hale's influence. Before going in, Lauren paused and looked at Ethan. "Don't let them control you. You're not the boy from 10 years ago. Now you have the power to decide." Her words were a reminder that Ethan had the strength to resist, that he wasn't doomed to be a victim again. With bated breath, Ethan nodded, and they began to move silently, slipping through the shadows toward the heart of the compound, where Hale and his followers awaited them. The final confrontation was about to begin. The darkness fell quickly over the mountains as the cold wind cut through their skin like invisible blades. Ethan and Lauren knew this would be the decisive moment. The compound building loomed before them, as desolate and cold as the memories Ethan had tried to bury for so long. But now, there was no more time for doubts or fears. Sarah was in danger, and every second counted. The trees swayed in an eerie rhythm, and the silence was only broken by the crunching of branches underfoot. Lauren moved with precision, her movements calculated after years of training. Ethan, however, struggled to keep his focus. The fear for his sister consumed him, but he had learned the hard way that giving in to panic wouldn't save anyone. "Stay behind me," Lauren whispered. Her tone was serious, leaving no room for emotions. She was the professional in this situation, while Ethan was still the desperate brother. But he needed someone with a clear mind for what was to come. The compound was partially illuminated by yellowish streetlights, indicating more activity than they could see from outside. "Damn it," Lauren thought, watching the shadows move inside the windows. She knew they were prepared for them. It wouldn't be an easy mission. They moved quickly but cautiously, always staying close to the outer walls. Ethan could feel his heart racing, his thoughts revolving around what might be happening to Sarah at that very moment. Are they torturing her? Will they kill her if we go in? He couldn't stop those images from flooding his mind, and each one heightened his desperation. They reached a side door, one of the many leading into the compound. Lauren opened it gently, signaling Ethan to follow. As they advanced, they could hear murmurs in the air. There was movement in the building, but it wasn't clear how many people were there. "They'll kill her if we don't get her out now," Ethan said through clenched teeth. Lauren looked at him, her eyes determined. "That's not going to happen." They reached a hallway that led to the core of the building. Lauren scanned with her tactical flashlight, ensuring there were no traps or people lying in wait. Suddenly, they heard a muffled scream echoing down the hallway. Ethan felt his entire body tense. "It's her," he whispered, his voice breaking. "It's Sarah." Before Lauren could stop him, Ethan ran toward the direction of the scream. Desperation was now his only driving force. He couldn't wait any longer, not when he knew his sister could be about to die. He turned the corner and reached a closed door. Without thinking, he began pounding on it forcefully. "Sarah! Sarah!" he shouted, slamming the wood with all his strength. From the other side, he heard his sister's muffled voice, "Ethan!" Lauren ran after him, knowing that mistake could cost them their lives. "Ethan, stop! They're listening to us!" But it was already too late. The door burst open, and a large, burly man, clearly part of the cult, grabbed him by the shirt, throwing him against the wall. The impact stunned Ethan, who fell to the floor, dazed. His vision darkened for a second, but adrenaline kept him alert. Lauren quickly drew her weapon and fired twice, hitting the man in the torso. He fell to the ground with a heavy thud, writhing on the floor. "Don't move," Lauren said, her voice cold and professional. Ethan stood up as best he could, staggering as he approached the room. There was Sarah, tied to a chair, her eyes swollen, her face covered in tears. "Sarah!" Ethan shouted, running toward her. When he hugged her, he felt her body trembling. The relief was fleeting. They weren't out of danger yet. "I found you," Ethan whispered, swiftly untying the ropes that kept her bound. "We need to get out of here now," Lauren said, her voice sharp. "They've heard us. This is going to get ugly." They had barely left the room when they heard more hurried footsteps coming from the corridors. "This way!" Lauren shouted, leading them back through the same path they had entered. Ethan held Sarah tightly, who could barely walk due to the physical and emotional trauma she had endured. The light suddenly went out. "Damn it!" Lauren cursed, adjusting her flashlight on the barrel of her gun. They ran through the hallways, but the exit was blocked. Two more men, part of the cult, emerged from the shadows, holding knives. Lauren didn't hesitate. She aimed and fired, hitting one in the leg, while the other charged at them. Ethan, acting on pure instinct, grabbed a piece of metal from the floor and threw it with all his strength at the approaching man. The metal struck his face, causing him to stagger backward. "Let's go!" Lauren shouted, pushing Sarah forward. Finally, they reached the main door, but just as they were about to exit, Isaac Hale appeared, blocking the way with terrifying calmness. "Did you really think you could escape, Ethan?" Hale said with a sinister smile. "You know that a part of me will always be in your mind." Ethan looked at him, his hands trembling with rage and fear. "I won't let you control me ever again." Hale pulled a gun from his jacket and pointed it directly at Ethan. "I don't need to control you to destroy you," he said, pulling the trigger. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the building, but Lauren, in a split second, lunged toward Ethan, pushing him out of the way. The bullet grazed Ethan's shoulder and struck a nearby wall. "Let's go!" Lauren shouted, firing at Hale to force him to take cover. Hale dove backward, allowing the three of them to run out of the door. The night was darker than ever as Ethan, Sarah, and Lauren fled the compound. The cold seeped through their clothes, and the silence was broken only by the echo of their hurried steps and labored breaths. They had escaped, but the sense of danger still clung to them like a shadow. Ethan couldn't shake off the last encounter with Isaac Hale. His words echoed in his mind. "You'll always have a part of me." He knew that even though they had gotten out alive, it wasn't over. He had managed to protect his sister, but now the mental scars Hale had left seemed deeper than ever. Lauren's car was hidden among the trees near the edge of the mountains. They moved quickly, helping Sarah, who could barely walk, but they couldn't afford to stop. Ethan, holding his sister tightly, whispered comforting words. "We're out, Sarah. We made it. I've got you." Finally, after what seemed like hours running through the darkness, they reached the car. Lauren, with expert hands, checked Sarah to make sure she wasn't seriously injured. She was weak, but physically and emotionally exhausted. "He's following us," Ethan said, looking around, searching for shadows among the trees. He knew the cult wouldn't give up so easily. And the worst part was, he feared that Isaac Hale might be right. A part of him was still trapped in the mental control he had suffered. Lauren got them into the car, started the engine, and stepped on the accelerator. "We have to get to the nearest police station," she said firmly, without losing focus. "It's only a matter of time before they do too." The winding dark road reflected the emotional state they were all in. Ethan looked out the window, feeling the danger still clinging to them. Escaping didn't mean the end. It had only given them a small advantage. They drove in silence, nerves still on edge. Sarah, still weak, broke the silence with a barely audible voice. "Ethan, what they did there, what they did to you," she began, her eyes filled with tears. "I saw things. I heard things." Ethan looked at her, unsure of how to comfort her. "You don't have to talk about it now," he said softly, but Sarah shook her head. "No, you need to know," she continued. They controlled you, Ethan, but they also talked about something else, that you were important to them, that they needed you for something big. They mentioned rituals, things I didn't understand. It was like you were the key to their goal." Ethan's heart stopped for a moment. "What do you mean they needed me?" he asked, his voice breaking with fear and confusion. Sarah, with tears streaming slowly down her cheeks, added, "I didn't fully understand, but they talked about you as if you were the chosen one for something bigger, as if your return was part of a plan. Isaac Hale said you were the key to a final ritual, but I don't know what it means." Sarah's words only added more weight to the pressure in Ethan's mind. Had his disappearance really been more than just a kidnapping? Was there a hidden purpose, a plan Hale had been waiting to complete? The fragmented memories of the rituals, the voices, the hooded figures, all blended in his mind like pieces of a macabre puzzle he still couldn't put together. Revelations in the car. Lauren, keeping her eyes on the road, listened intently. Everything Sarah described matched what she had discovered about Isaac Hale's cult. It wasn't just about mental control, it was something deeper, something darker, an organization operating in the shadows with goals no one else could comprehend. Isaac Hale wasn't just a mind manipulator, Lauren finally said, breaking the silence. What Sarah describes fits a pattern I've seen in other cases. The cult uses rituals to break people's will, but in your case, Ethan, there was something bigger at play. They didn't just want to break you, they wanted you for something specific. Ethan stared at the ground, trying to process what he was hearing. Then why didn't they kill me? He asked. If they needed me for something, why let me escape? Lauren remained silent for a moment, choosing her words carefully before responding. Maybe they didn't let you escape completely. Maybe you're still part of their plan, even if you don't know it. Maybe they wanted you to come back, to complete something without you even being aware of it. Ethan felt a deeper chill in his stomach. How do I fight something I don't even understand? They finally arrived at the nearest police station. It was a small building, lit with neon signs glowing in the dark of night. Lauren entered with Sarah and Ethan, quickly explaining the situation to the officer on duty. As Sarah was taken to a room to be examined, Ethan stayed alone in a corner, watching as the world seemed to move on around him. Lauren approached him. You need help, Ethan. This isn't over. You know the cult won't stop just because we escaped this time. Ethan nodded, but he was exhausted. The feeling of having physically broken away from the cult gave him no solace. They'll never leave me alone, will they? He asked, his voice low. Lauren looked at him seriously, offering no false comforts. Probably not, but you're not alone. Not anymore. Hours later, as the sun began to rise on the horizon, Ethan stepped out of the police station and sat on the steps, watching the sky slowly change colors. They had survived, but something inside told him that the real battle wasn't over. Sarah, now safe, was resting inside, and that gave him some relief. But the weight of the future still pressed down on him. He knew that even though they had escaped this time, Isaac Hale and the cult wouldn't give up so easily. He felt that something dark was still lurking, something beyond his understanding. Maybe I'll never truly escape, he thought, staring at the horizon. But there was one thing he knew for sure. He wouldn't let himself be controlled again. This time, even if the shadows chased him, he wouldn't let them break him again. The wind blew gently, and for the first time in a long time, Ethan felt that he had at least partial control over his destiny. He stood up, took a deep breath, and walked back into the building, ready for whatever came next. That's all for today. If you enjoyed this story and want to know what happens next, leave us a comment so we can bring the second part. Don't forget to give it a like, subscribe, and hit the bell to not miss any details. See you in the next video.